Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 11th of August, and you are watching episode 18 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates. Joining me on this episode, river flows, competing priorities, the environment, town water, agricultural and artificial lakes, is my guest Dr Marohasy. Jennifer is a biologist, author, columnist and blogger who credits her career choice to wagging a year of school as a 7-year-old when she and her family experienced all that nature had to offer along the Queensland coast, from Cooktown to Hervey Bay. Her early career as a field biologist took her to Africa and Madagascar. However, it was her role as a senior fellow with the Institute of Public Affairs that brought Jennifer to the attention of the wider public. With the rise of climate change concerns, impact on the environment became front and centre, with alarming claims that drought was the new norm and our dams would never fill again. Of course, major river systems came under scrutiny, particularly Murray and the Darling rivers, South Australian lower lakes, and the Coorong and the Murray estuary. Enter Dr Jennifer Marohasy in her study of the lower lakes and the Coorong, challenged the then current orthodoxy and drew the ire of climate change proponents with their media and cheer squad. Fortunately, Jennifer is still prepared to stand on the parapets, now with her marine research on the Great Barrier Reef. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, it's lovely to be with you this evening, Bill.
It's a pleasure. If we could just start off with a little bit of, well, maybe you're wagging a year at school and the adventures you had there, and then moving on to why you chose the field you've entered to through biology and now all your climate research.
So I guess I am a farmer's daughter. I grew up on a cattle station in the Territory, and actually my parents sold up there when I was about 7, and that's why we set off on with the adventure in the caravan. And I've been talking about that a bit more recently with the Great Barrier Reef work that I've been doing, because I remember, for example, snorkeling Horseshoe Bay in Bowen. We stayed in the caravan in Bowen. You know, this is back 50 years and people talk about, you know, the situation changing. But, you know, I've been, I guess, diving Great Barrier Reef along the Queensland coast for 50 years now. And, you know, it's for that long that people have been saying that it's all going to be lost to Crown of Thorns, or some most recently coral bleaching. But the reality is it's you know, there are reefs that are very badly affected by cyclones, then they tend to recover. There was bad coral bleaching back in 2016, but since then, over the last 5 years, there's been really quite spectacular recovery, particularly in the north. So things tend to cycle. So I guess, yeah, I was born in Darwin. I spent a lot of time working in regional Queensland, and perhaps my first love is the Great Barrier Reef in North Australia. But it was back in 2003 that the IPA actually asked me if I'd look at salinity levels, which everybody said at that time in the Murray River, and that Adelaide's water supply would soon be so salty that it would be undrinkable. And the newspaper headlines, and there was a lot back then. Wendy Craig was often on the ABC talking about the need for land care and huge amounts of federal funding to reverse this rising salinity trend. And back in 2003, I was asked to actually have a look at the data, which I got from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And when I crunched it, I actually found that all of what was being said nationally, and at that time newspaper was running a Save the Murray campaign. It was all based on modelling, it's simulation modelling. It wasn't actually based on actual measured salinity levels. For example, at Moore, when you actually looked at actual levels, they had been increasing through the 50s and 70s, but then these drainage management plans were put in to address the salinity issues, particularly in the Riverina, and salinity levels have been coming down. And when I took my data and my findings to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and said, but you're telling everybody about worst case scenarios predicted decades ago, the situation in reality is turned around, and they were saying things to me like, yes, but if we tell people that it's okay and we report the good news, then maybe they'll stop worrying and maybe salinity levels will start going up again. And I'm going, no, you can't do that. Like, we had John Anderson, I think at the time was the Minister for Agriculture, and he was looking at, and John Howard was the Prime Minister, they were looking at taking amazing amounts of water off irrigators without compensating the basis that they. And back then they weren't talking about climate change, they were talking about salinity. And as a consequence of my work and it being promoted by the IPA, but really it didn't, none of this made national headlines. The Australian newspaper, Chris Mitchell was the editor, he pulled their Save the Murray campaign. Don Blackmore, who was at the time head of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, took early retirement. John Williams, who was head of Siro Land and Water, he went and got another job. And they just all of a sudden stopped talking about the output from the models, so they didn't acknowledge there wasn't a salinity problem. They just basically just stopped with all that alarmist talk about salinity. But then they started up just a few years later with drought and climate change. You know, they just have to have some, when I say they, I'm not hearing you very well. I'm not sure if we've got a good connection.
No, I can hear you. No, in the same period, enter stage right was Tim Flannery and John Doyle, and two men in the tinny going down the Darling, which was a real scare campaign in regards to the period where it will never rain again and the dams would never fill. So that's the sort of alarmism that comes with the territory. As in your first instance with the salinity, they need that to make it dramatic and get the coverage and get the attention from both politicians and the funding.
So they stopped talking about salinity around 2004, 2005, but then there was terrible drought through 2009. And the lower lakes were drying up, but all they needed to do, because we were seeing these pictures on the ABC about how the very bottom of the system was drying up, but all they actually had to do was open the barrages and let the seawater in. But you know, neither Tim Flannery nor the ABC nor Wendy Craig or anybody would talk about the extent to which that Lower Lakes region was, call it Lower Lakes, it was once a vibrant estuary. So, and they've got 7.6 kilometres of barrage, essentially sea dike. And so back had the terrible drought 2009, they weren't letting the water in. They weren't seawater in. The problem by the barrages, letting those lakes flood with seawater, because before the barrages were built, and they were built in the 1930s, before then, sometimes the lower lakes, what they call the lower lakes, really the Murray River's estuary, sometimes the area was full of salt water and sometimes it was full of fresh water.
You have a bit of a conflict there in regards to people talking about the environment and nature, yet they're trying to preserve something that was basically altered by man. So it's fairly unreasonable in regards to, you say we want, this is the pristine state and we want more fresh water to flow down the Murray to keep it that way. When you've changed the dynamics of the environment through these barrages, and I think it was your paper sort of threw a lot of light on that, and immediately you got the likes of the people on ABC and other commentators sort of taking offence to your data and your report.
So it's interesting, back in 2011, I went and saw lots of politicians in Canberra about how longer term, yes, there is some water going out of the system because of irrigation, but hey, historically, the water tumbled down, say, if you're talking about the Murray, come spring with the snow melt, and then it actually used to go across the floodplain. That's why we've got those thick and Beige, because the water used to just go across those plains, and then it used to constrict and go down and into Alexandrina. And now we do have the dams at the top of this actually hold significant amounts of water, so you can irrigate in summer, you can hold water for stock and domestic, and we actually have a dam capacity which is such that there is no reason for people to all the environment in that upper Murray region to ever go without water. But there's actually not necessarily enough water now, even with our dam capacities, to keep the lower lakes full, because of the area. We're talking about 75,000 hectares or thereabouts of lake area, including the Coorong. So people, I don't know how many people would know about Port Phillip Bay off Melbourne. That's almost the same size as the lower lakes at the bottom of the Murray. So nobody expects the Yarra River that runs through Melbourne, for example, to keep Port Phillip Bay full of fresh water, but they seem to expect the Murray and Darling to keep this. It's a vast area full of fresh water upstream of the barrages. Now, I've talked, for example, to Sarah Hanson-Young and Simon Birmingham and other South Australian politicians about that if we really are in this for the environment, because I want to take water off the farmers for the environment, I'm saying surely the best thing to do is look for Murray River's estuary. Why is it that our longest, most famous river system, the Murray-Darling, doesn't have a functioning estuary? And this is 2021, and we're meant to care about the environment. And everybody goes, shh, shh. They don't want to talk about it. Sarah Hanson-Young does not want to talk about it. She's with the Greens, right? I say to Simon Birmingham, the Liberal Party, if you want to really do the right thing in South Australia, surely we should be looking at restoring the Murray River's estuary. And, you know, I think they went to school together, Sarah Hanson-Young and Simon Birmingham. They'll tell me each of them, the Greens and the Liberal Party in South Australia, is never going to move on that. They're going to complain about how much water is taken by irrigators upstream, but they're never going to do anything about addressing this issue in South Australia of of the fact that the Murray-Darling doesn't have an estuary because they built these barrages. And it all comes down to parochial politics. It all comes down to, you know, who built this property development in that region. They want fresh water. They want to sell housing blocks so that you can pump from the lakes and year round, and that we're going to get increasing flows from upstream because of these billion-dollar water schemes. It's just going to fresh water for South Australia, but not actually for any natural environment in South Australia, but for the lower lakes that are now either completely surrounded by farmland or increasingly, these urban developments, these marina developments, and they just, but nobody can talk about this. I mean, Australia 2021, we can't talk about the fact, the ABC will not let me talk about the fact that the Murray River system does not have a functioning estuary. And if it did have a functioning estuary, that would take all the pressure off irrigation upstream, but it would also make more water available for upstream wetlands, both during periods of average rainfall, but particularly during periods of drought. At the moment, very few people know that the lower lakes, they're actually full of carp, and people might go to Bunnings and buy Charlie carp. Well, all of that Charlie carp industry dependent
on the breeding in there. Looks like Jennifer's dropped out for a little bit. Hopefully get her back very soon. But it is concerning in regards to how environmentalists play in regards to the environment, but then when it suits them, they'll play to an artificial situation, such as the lakes, in the lower lakes in South Australia, and won't even consider returning it back to its natural state, because it doesn't suit their ideology or their terms at this point in time. And also, it takes the drama out of the situation. And we know with instances like this and with climate change, we've got to have the drama, we've got to have the panic, and we've got to have news coverage that is frightening. And we're seeing that now with the recent IPCC sixth assessment report, which starts off basically with the director at the UN giving us a statement that we're now entered into code red for climate change and global warming. So again, it's the same old thing in regards to we've got to have drama to get stories out. If there's no drama, there's no story. We never want to dampen the situation with good news. We don't want to dampen the situation in regards to the Arctic and the polar bears when they were the poster child for climate change. It's taken a long time for the emphasis to go away because people like Susan Crockford has shown that polar bear numbers were on the increase, and they weren't starving because of the lack of ice floes in the Arctic Circle. And they're all doing very well now. They're doing so well now, they are actually a nuisance in many parts of Hudson Bay and on the Russian mainland. So that's how much things change, but they don't for the better, but we don't hear much of that. We just go from the next one poster boy for the climate change people to the next. And currently it's the Great Barrier Reef. It's getting flogged. It's dying. We've got to do everything. We've saved it. It's the most critical thing that we need to do. And there's always a price to be paid. And it's the price is usually paid by farmers, both in the situation on the Murray-Darling. We're just continuing in regards to the IPCC and its latest report. It's interesting that you have although it's a 4,000-page report, it does still cherry picks information, and it's not inclusive of the whole story. And it's quite interesting in regards to the summary to policymakers and how that sort of starts off. And I'll just show a screen of one of their little graphs to catch the attention of politicians. On the screen now we have from the summary to policymakers. It's interesting in their opening statement that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, land, and widespread rapid changes to the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. So that's a good one to sort of start the politicians into action. And the graphs here, it's quite interesting. They've got reconstructed the temperature, and we can all notice that things, this goes back some to the year one, so 2,000 odd years ago. So the reconstruction, there's hardly a murmur there in regards to the things like the Roman warming period or the medieval warming period. And then you can see the day's temperature is supposedly so much higher than any time in the past, which basically is a falsehood. But there again, there's nothing like a good very quick drawing. And on the right here, we have natural and observed. So they're showing that human activity has pushed up the temperature. And there's no basically natural variations. Everything would stay, if there was only natural variation, it would stay constant, which again wipes out the fact or the history in regards to in previous times. We know that the temperature has changed dramatically over the period, especially again the Roman warming period in the medieval period, especially over this time. So it's very interesting in regards to trying to push back this temperature down to where it was supposedly before, when it's been at that level previously. And who said warming is bad? Because the emphasis is always on what the temperature was. It's now 1.5 degrees warmer than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. But who wants to go back to a world where 1.5 degrees cooler than it is now? A time when there was major famines because of crop failure, major events introduced blights and that to the crops. Returning to a period when the Thames River froze over. What's the desirability of that? I don't think the people in Britain would be overly keen to go back to the days of the 1813 when the last time the Thames River froze over.
Hello, can anybody hear?
Aha, we're back. If we could just move on to, if we could just finish up on the Coorong and that, and your perception of why no one wants to hear good news.
Well, I think that there's just vested interests. South Australia wants more water, and it's used the idea of the lower lakes drying, but not telling people that was once an estuary as part of their campaign to get more water. They want more water. They want more fresh water. But nobody's transparent or upfront about why. I mean, the Greens campaign on the idea that we're ruining the environment, that the Murray-Darling is ruined by farmers, but they're not actually. You know, for a long time they talked about salinity levels rising, when in actual fact there were salinity problems during the 60s and 70s, as I said. But then these drainage programs were put in place, and they got salinity levels right down and right back to what might be considered normal. So, you know, we live at a time when it's very fashionable to lament the state of the poor state of the natural environment, whether it's the Great Barrier Reef, the Murray-Darling, this latest IPCC report suggesting that we're all about to fry because temperatures are increasing. You know, generally, you know, we live at a time when people are against so much that we actually have to be grateful for, which is, you know, reliable supplies of food and energy. So they're trying to close down coal mines on the basis that carbon dioxide's a problem, when in reality, yes, carbon dioxide levels are increasing, but there's actually no evidence to suggest, when you take the longer term perspective and you look at the raw data, not the output from simulation models, that there's anything particularly unusual about either the magnitude or rate of temperature increase. And temperatures have been increasing globally since the 1960s, but you know what? Temperatures were decreasing to the 1960s, and we had, of course, those headlines. If you go back and look at newspaper reports in the 1960s, they were talking about a coming ice age. And then temperatures started to increase, and now they're remodeling the data and suggesting that there's been this increase in temperature that you can take back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So they say since the 1850s, there's been this temperature increase. Well, in fact, prior to that, we had a little ice age when, yes, temperatures were cold globally, and there has been overall an increase in temperatures, but it may have very little to do with industrialization and more to do with natural climate cycles. That's not to say or to deny that people are having a local impact on temperatures. For example, cities generally are warmer than other places because of the urban heat island effect. And for example, talking about the Murray-Darling with irrigation, you can actually see a cooling, an overall cooling, particularly in minimum temperatures in places like Rutherglen, because now you've got all this water, so you've got evaporative cooling on quite a grand scale. So there's a lot of regional variability in rainfall, in temperature, nothing particularly unprecedented, and yet the newspaper headlines are suggesting that that our environment's going to hell in a handbasket. And I really do feel sorry for the kids who worry about this, and they worry because all the experts are telling them that sea levels are rising. And I just say to them, look, go and have a walk on your local beach and have a look around. And if it's not high tide, if it's low tide, it actually, you know, it might. And look at the coastline. Can you actually see evidence more generally of catastrophic sea level rise? And right along the Queensland coast, Northern Territory, and even where I am at the moment in South Australia, what we generally tend to see is evidence for sea level fall, because if you take the longer perspective, since the Holocene high stand about 4,500 years ago, it's well documented, particularly for the east coast of Australia, that we've had a 1.5 meter fall in sea level over the last few thousand years. That's one of the longer term cycles. That's not to deny that over the last 100 or so years, we've had a 36 centimeter increase in sea level. And people say to me, well, how can you have increasing and also declining? Well, you have cycles within cycles. At one day at the beach where I live at Noosa, where I usually am, you can have the tide coming in and you can have then the tide going out. So you've got these diurnal cycles. You have these 18.6 year cycles relating to lunar declination. And then because of the changing orbit of the Earth around the sun, you have ice ages and interglacial warm periods. And at the moment, we're in an interglacial warm period, a geological epoch known as the Holocene.
And thank heavens we are. I mean, civilization has only ever known an interglacial period, but our forefathers back in, you know, going back to the Stone Age and that, they've basically endured several glacial periods that we would not like to see in the near future. But I suppose we're destined to, future generations, maybe in 1,000 or 2,000 years, we'll start seeing the signs of returning to that into that glacial period. But I'm always fascinated by the reference to pre-industrial levels. I mean, pre-industrial levels, if you actually talking about the Industrial Revolution, actually dates back to 1770, but the general consensus is, well, it started to have an impact starting in the 1850s. But we're just coming out of the depths of the ice age. It was I think 1813 was the last time the Thames River froze over. But in the preceding centuries, there had been a number of times that it had frozen, and prior to 1830, there had been a number of ice fairs annually on the Thames River. So it's fairly dramatic what can happen with the climate in a very short time, and a lot of it, and it obviously happens without our help. And yes, now we are a factor. It would be quite interesting if we could really sort out the wheat from the chaff in regards to our input versus the natural variation, which everyone seems to conveniently ignore.
So this issue of natural variation is interesting. In previous IPCC reports, they really said there was no they just didn't talk about the natural component to climate change. In this latest report that came out on Tuesday, they're talking about a 1.07 degree increase in temperature since 1850. So hardly anything in the scheme of things when you think about diurnal variation. But of that, they're saying that it's 0.1 degree natural and that the rest is human. And it's a 4,000 page report. I'm trying to work out how they come up with this 0.1 degree natural. I did some work a few years ago, published a paper in a journal called GeoRes-J, and I came up with at the very most a 0.2 degree human influence and about a 0.6 degree increase in temperature since the industrial. But that was a lot of modeling work using artificial neural networks. But you know, you can come up with different figures and values, but I guess yeah, as you say, when you take the longer perspective and you look at the many technical papers published, for example, on temperature variation over the last 2,000 years, you know, there are all these cycles, temperature cycles. And you're talking about the Thames freezing over. Well, it froze over on the 12th of February this year, 2021. And the last time it froze over was in 1963, the year that I was born. You've got approximately 60-year cycle there. We've got the IPCC saying it's never been so warm, according to their computer models. Yet the reality is the headlines worldwide on the 12th of February this year was about the Thames freezing over. And of course, we've had cold winters in the Northern Hemisphere these last few years. I actually think you're talking about how many times the Thames froze over during the Little Ice Age. I think it was 23 times from the end of the medieval warm period, from about 1300 AD to 1814, the Thames froze over at least 23 times. It's more difficult for that river system to freeze over now because of all the changes to the a narrowing of the river so that you've got more flow. All of this happened when they built London Bridge, which I think was in 1831. So it's changed the flows, and I think there's more salt water in the system, so that it froze over earlier this year means that it must have been really cold. And yet all of that is denied. And the crazy thing is the journalists that aren't asking the questions. They're not saying to these IPCC people who put this report out on Tuesday, hang on, you're saying that it's really hot globally, but what about things like the Thames freezing over earlier this year? You know, the media cycle is I really do feel sorry for kids trying to make sense of all of this, and I know a lot of them are really frightened by the idea that the Great Barrier Reef is on its way out because of climate change and coral bleaching, and that, you know, that we're all going to fry, when the reality is temperatures are cycling. It's a bit warm generally at the moment, but nothing unusual about the rate or magnitude of climate change when you look at the raw data as opposed to the output from the simulation models. Yeah, and when you think about things like how cold it has been, and also how warm it has been in places like England over the last 2,000 years.
But the media thrives on shocking headlines and, you know, and drama and doomsday. So sometimes it's counterproductive for them and their sales and the attention stand of the public if they don't come up with drama. It's like the polar bears, as I was saying before. It was there all the time in regards to, you know, they were the poster boys of climate change and they were in danger, and it was all sorts of things going on in regards to showing that they were starving, their numbers were dropping. But when it became evident through people like Susan Crockford, who was, you know, prepared to stand on the parapet and take the shots from the media and other scientists, who got the truth out there and did the research, did the tagging, and showed that the numbers were increasing right across the Hudson Bay and across the Russian mainland, and got it to the situation where there's some normality about the conversation. I mean, there's an occasional bit of drama, but it's definitely, they can't highlight the plight of the polar bear anymore. So the poster child now for the alarmists is the Great Barrier Reef. And the sad thing about that, there's casualties in this, and it seems to be that our farmers are the first ones to be sacrificed on the altar, with overbearing legislation and regulations that make their job and their productivity almost impossible, and adds extremely costly processes in regards to their farm management and their reporting. And that's the sad problem about it, is that there's people out there who, for the sake of dramatising the situation, are prepared to put our future agricultural sector at risk. No, not only for obviously for the Great Barrier Reef, but also on the Murray-Darling.
So Peter Reed's tried to sort of, I guess, emphasize the importance of some quality assurance when it comes to reef science, and I guess blow the whistle on the extent to which, you know, so much of the Great Barrier Reef research just, you know, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And I guess for his trouble, he was sacked by James Cook University. I don't know if you've been following
the court case.
You know, his attempts. Yeah, that's right. So we're expecting some sort of decision from the High Court in the next few weeks. I think that's going to be really important for Queensland farmers, because if Peter wins, I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on the government to actually look at a lot of the activism coming out of places like James Cook University and the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and actually look at ensuring that there's some quality assurance of reporting on coral cover,
coral calcification rates, extent of bleaching, recovery from bleaching. I think Peter Reid has done a great service not only to science but also to I guess everybody from the tourism industry to farmers in terms of drawing attention, to the extent to which the Great Barrier Reef is perhaps in good shape. It's just that that's not being reported because of, well, Peter always talks about a couple of things. He talks about people and many marine biologists being too attached to the reef and too attached to the ideas and that,
attached to the funding.
any bleaching is, well, yes, there's people like, the guy who has really gone after Peter is Professor Terry Hughes, and he is the person who flies over the reef at 150 meters altitude, from which I know, because I put drones up at that height, you can't actually see the state of the corals from that altitude, but he flies over and he says it's all bleached, and that makes headlines around the world. And people seem to, but not only has it historically generated more funding for his projects, but also he gets so many accolades. He's so revered by people because they seem to love this bad news. They love the idea that they don't admit it, but they seem so so excited by the idea that the Great Barrier Reef is being destroyed by climate change. They get so animated by the idea that there's been bad coral bleaching, and that it can be blamed on coal mines. When in actual fact, the reality is that bleaching tends to follow 18.6 year cycles that relate to the lunar declination cycle. You can see in the coral coring work that this has been happening for thousands of years, and it's at the same time that you have these bleaching events, you often have you have El Nino events. You have more of the water in the Pacific Ocean on the eastern side of the Pacific, and the western side of the Pacific, which is the east coast of Australia. You've actually got quite dramatic drops in sea level. So people sort of think about sea level continuing to go up because that's the media headlines. The reality is that sea level cycles, and so places like Cairns actually have drops in sea level when you have El Nino events, and they often correspond with more coral exposed on very low tides, and then you get bleaching. It's actually quite complex, and I think it's actually fascinating how all of this works, and yet it gets reported as something to do with industrialization and being unprecedented and being something that's only started to occur recently, when the reality is, as Peter Reid probably explains better than most, there's actually nothing new about coral bleaching. It follows cycles. It can be devastating. Reefs that have been newly bleached look terrible, and there were a lot of reefs that were bleached as recently as 2016, which was a period of minimum lunar declination. But guess what? I was up looking at some of those worst bleached reefs just before COVID struck, so just the beginning of last year, and they'd already come back. I was diving with people who'd seen reefs off Cooktown, going right out to the Ribbons. So you're looking at just to the east of Lizard Island. right on the edge of the continental shelf. I was diving with people who said, look, Jen, this reef, these corals were just so badly bleached in 2016. Here we are 4 years later. So I was diving those reefs January 2020, and they were saying it's just amazing how the corals come back. And one of the divers was telling me, she works on one of the dive boats as a photographer, and she was saying she was watching corals that were so badly bleached late 2015, 2016, and they went completely white, but they actually held on, because corals, they can get their energy from the sun through the zooxanthellae, but when they get expelled, when a coral bleaches, corals still have tentacles, so they can actually get nutrients from phytoplankton and all sorts of things in the water. These corals hung on, and she actually said that she saw corals that were bleached for 5 months, spawning and then coming back to life, taking back the zooxanthellae. So people like Terry Hughes give the impression that when a reef's bleached, that's it, it's dead. The reality is a lot of these reefs, they bleach, they look terrible for months on end, but the corals hang on, they take back then the zooxanthellae, and they become colorful again, and they start growing and expanding, and they recover. Yeah.
With Terry Hughes' scientific method, it's no wonder he was not the one who discovered the new coral reef just on our further north than Lizard Island in November last year. I think there was an institute from the United States, and they came across a uprising from the sea floor, like a underwater mountain, came to within about 2 meters of the surface and dropped down to about 500 meters below, and it was full of life and corals, which hadn't been found. So I'd expect it takes a lot to actually get out there and find out the realities of the reef and what's going out there, and flying 150 meters over the top's not going to do the job.
What you'll do is at 150 meters, you actually see the reef crest. So the area that I'm talking about, for example, the ribbons, you've got reef crest there, which has been dead for 2,000 years, because we've had the sea level drop over that period of time. So, for example, if we go back to not the last, so we had the mini ice age in the 1600s, but if we go back 16,000 years to the depths of the last glacial period, when the Australian landmass was connected to New Guinea and to Tasmania, for example, there was no Great Barrier Reef, and then sea levels rose, and you've got the modern Great Barrier Reef forming with the beginning of this Holocene period about 10,000 years ago, and it grew up a bit higher than because sea levels were along the east coast of Australia about 1.5 meters higher if we go back about 4,000 years, Holocene high stand, and then sea levels drop. So you've got these reef crests, which are actually just dead coral. Now you can see them when you fly over from a plane, but down the walls, so the ribbon reefs, down the walls, you've got all this beautiful live coral. You can't see that from the air. You can't see that from the air. So they do these surveys, and his technical papers actually say that he's reporting on what's at the reef crests. So he's technically, to some extent, correct in so much as he's saying we're doing the flyovers, we're reporting on the reef crest, but hey, nobody's saying, but wouldn't you expect these reef crests to be dead? And aren't the live corals actually down the walls and in the back lagoon? And isn't it true that you can't see the state of those corals from the plane? So this is why people like Peter Ritter saying there needs to be some quality assurance, and instead of actually saying, yeah, well, let's do some quality assurance, they're sacking Peter. James Cook University has sacked Peter for asking for quality assurance of Great Barrier Reef surveys, including the work of Terry Hughes with his flyovers. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. All this, to people who aren't familiar and haven't been following the story, my work, Peter Ridd's work, for a lot of years, would think this was outrageous and we must be making it all up. The reality is no. The reality is it's well documented that Terry Hughes flies in these planes at 150 meters. He subjectively scores these reefs. And then they put the score together and they say that that the Great Barrier Reef's in poor shape. Yet go to these same reefs, some of them at the time of, say, the 2016 bleaching, and they weren't too bad. Others were in really bad condition. But hey, they've come back. I know Peter's been making a bit or explaining that the AIMS surveys, that's the Australian Institute of Marine Science, they actually do underwater surveys of coral cover, and they've actually shown they're the surveys that have shown the rebound from the 2016 bleaching. So I guess there's Terry Hughes's flyovers. There's the AIMS coral cover surveys, which are actually done underwater, but they are still exceedingly subjective. AIMS used to do coral coring work, but that's basically there's no reporting on that now for about 15 years. And I know Peter would like the coral coring work to recommence, and for them to go back to the techniques that were used in the 1980s and 1990s, when it was said, well, actually probably with some warming of sea temperatures, there may be an increase in coral growth.
But just continuing on in regards to, it's also concerning about the limits of the Great Barrier Reef under the World Heritage listing and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. It covers far too many shallow inshore reefs that need to be taken off that list. So we don't have wild claims on these shallow inshore reefs. We need to stick to the real core of our interest in the Greater Barrier Reef, and it's being further offshore, where you can expect some sort of more reasonable continuity in the standard of what's existing on the reef, whereas the inshore reefs are subject to tidal variations far too much and bleaching.
I actually think that the reality is that we should be looking at the state of the inshore reefs and also the mid-shelf reefs and also the outer reefs. So the ribbons are your outer reef, and places like Britomart are your mid-shelf reef, and then you've got inshore reefs, for example, in Bowen Harbour. And I made a little film called Beige Reef. I don't know if you've seen it, but if people Google Beige Reef, BEIGE Reef, and maybe throw my name in as well, Jennifer Marohasy, they'll come up with a little short 13-minute doco about the reefs in Bowen Harbour. And there was so much said, including by Terry Hughes, about how these reefs are now just rubble and mudflat. And this was reported, this was front page AIMS, front page Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority website. And Peter Ridd said, well, actually, no, there's still good coral there. It's just the other side of the mudflats. And the mudflats have always been there. And then there's coral reef at places like Bramston Reef, which is just to the south of Bowen, within the what I would consider the area of Bowen Harbour. And there's still coral around Stone Island, and Peter making a fuss about that caused his first censure by the university. Now, I was actually concerned that coral might have all been destroyed when I think it was Cyclone Debbie hit in 2015. But I actually went back, what was it, 2 years ago now with an underwater photographer to actually have a look in Bowen Harbour and see how much coral's there. And there's so much coral and it's so beautiful. Okay, it's inshore reef. A lot of it's beige in colour, but some of it's got the most beautiful. There's also beautiful purples, beautiful greens, beautiful blues, but a predominance of beige corals. But hey, beige is the dominant colour of corals around the world, but people just don't seem to know that. But look, there's so much beautiful inshore coral reef. And what I love about the inshore reefs is that people can actually get out there and see it. So you don't have to pay a fortune to go out with, you know, with the cruises off Cairns or somewhere else. You can actually go. You can snorkel Horseshoe Bay, for example, which is in the township of Bowen, which is what I did when I was 7.
Do you think we need to redefine the Great Barrier Reef a little bit and take some of the inshore reefs out of the equation?
No, I don't. I actually think that by including the inshore reefs, if we did proper work, we'd actually be able to see if there is an effect from agriculture on reefs, like, for example, the High Island Reef, just you know, just south of Cairns. And I think that, I mean, I've dived that reef and it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful inshore reef, and we could core the parietes and we could see if there was any effect from agriculture. And I would hypothesize, just looking at the reef, that that there probably wasn't. But let's have a look, because you can core these very large old corals. They've got growth bands like tree rings, where you can actually look at temperature change and changes in growth of trees, looking at tree rings, taking these slithers. You can take slithers from corals and you can actually see how their growth has changed over the last 100, 200 years. And you can see if agriculture has actually had an effect on them. You've got some of these corals that are 400 years old. Let's actually see if there is an impact from agriculture on these nearshore reefs. I'd be brave and actually core the inshore reefs, core the midshore reefs, and core the outer reefs. And I think that you'll find that even with the inshore reefs, there's very little impact from land-based activities. That's my hypothesis.
So you have a good level of confidence in our farmers that they are good custodians of the land and they aren't vandals, and they're managing their property and our reef fairly well.
So I just know, say, with the sugar industry, if you go back to the early days of the sugar industry, particularly in North Queensland, when they cut the cane and they grew it on the slopes, there was a lot of, there was really significant runoff. But then when they went to harvesting with mechanical harvesting, they stopped growing the cane on the slopes and it was more on the flat land. So there was a lot less sediment runoff. And then, of course, more recently with the move to green cane trash blanketing, you've got a lot less potential for soil erosion, for movement of pesticide and herbicide off farm.
I think another thing is technology has come such a long way as well, you know, and we're looking of a future with nanotechnology to deliver pesticides and fertilizers in even smaller quantities than are currently delivered today, get the same productivity.
That's right. That's right. So I think that, you know, I would be interested to see if we can find, by coring the very large old corals, they're called parietes, and I put a little movie out. Your viewers may want to Google Finding Parietes, P-O-R-I-T-E-S, and I show these corals and I show how you can core them. So I'd be very interested to see if we can see an impact from agriculture on the reefs just out from, say, the Russell Mulgrave, just south of Cairns, going back to the 1930s, 40s and 50s. If we can see if we can find any pesticide going back to the years when we did use a lot of pesticide, and maybe now, you know, very little sediment, very little pesticide, maybe better growth rates. And yeah, and compare that with corals mid shelf and outer shelf. So I think, you know, farming systems, they've changed so much over the last 100 years, but there's no talk about that. There's no discussion about, you know, I know that the Australian Conservation Council, Melbourne based, going back to the 1990s, they had targets for adoption of green cane trash blanketing in the Mackay region, and the industry worked with the Australian Conservation Council, and it met and exceeded those targets. But it's a little bit like the farmers in the Riverina addressing salinity problems. You know, these conservation groups make a big song and dance when there is a problem, and there were problems, I think, with erosion pre-green cane trash blanketing in the sugar industry. Why can't we have some discussion about farming now versus, you know, back 30 years and how it's changed?
Because that doesn't fit their scary narratives that they need to sort of get the legislation that they want introduced. I mean, you would have been aware when we had the Vegetation Management Act come in Queensland, and all the blue about that. We had some 722 submissions from the public, and not one word of that act was changed or the regulation was changed. So there always seems to be an agenda, and it doesn't seem to matter. They don't really want to hear the good news. They just want to promote the bad news.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not, you're coming in and out. I think we might need to
wind this up.
Call it quits until I get back to Queensland and get a better connection.
I thank you for your perseverance tonight. Yes, please contact me when you're in a much better situation, both in your back at home and enjoying Queensland again, and when you have a bit of time up your sleeve. We'll also be looking forward to another opportunity to speak to Jennifer in the near future to continue on with the discussion. Join me next week with, we'll be having Chris Brooks from the Southern Irrigators on the show, and he'll be talking about the farmers' situation along Darling River and the irrigation allocations for water and the demands put on them by the environmental flows that are mandated. So if you like the show, please like, follow and share on Facebook, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll see you again next week, and hopefully we have a better connection. Good night.